The dust kicked up by the wagon wheels created a thick cloud that seemed to follow Margaret Thompson wherever she went. She pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders, trying to shield herself from both the Arizona sun and the gritty particles that found their way into every crease of her clothing. At 23 years old, she had already endured more hardship than most women twice her age, but nothing had prepared her for this journey into what felt like the edge of the world. Margaret's husband, James, had died 3 months earlier from a fever that swept through their small farming community in Missouri. With mounting debts and no family to turn to, she had been forced to sell everything they owned. The only option that remained was to join her late husband's brother, William, who had written from a mining camp in the Arizona Territory, promising her a chance to start fresh. The letter had arrived like a lifeline, offering her work as a seamstress and cook for the miners. The wagon train she had joined consisted of 12 families, all heading west for different reasons. Some were seeking gold, others fleeing troubles back home, and a few were simply drawn by the promise of cheap land and new opportunities. Margaret kept mostly to herself during the 6-week journey, helping with cooking duties and mending clothes in exchange for passage and protection. As they traveled deeper into Apache territory, the mood of the group became increasingly tense. Stories of raids and kidnappings circulated around the evening campfires, each tale more frightening than the last. The wagon master, a grizzled man named Captain Porter, constantly reminded everyone to stay alert and never wander far from the group. He spoke of the Apache as if they were ghosts who could appear and disappear without warning, striking fear into even the bravest men among them. Margaret had grown up hearing similar stories about Native Americans, but she had never encountered any herself. Her father had fought in various conflicts with different tribes during his time in the cavalry, and his tales had painted a picture of savage warriors who showed no mercy. As a child, these stories had seemed like something from another world, but now, traveling through their ancestral lands, the possibility of encounter felt very real. The landscape around them grew more harsh and beautiful with each passing day. Towering red rocks jutted up from the desert floor like ancient sentinels, and strange plants she had never seen before dotted the horizon. Cactus flowers bloomed in brilliant colors that seemed impossible in such a barren environment. Despite the danger everyone spoke of, Margaret found herself drawn to the wild beauty of this untamed land. On the morning that would change everything, the wagon train was following a narrow trail through a canyon when scouts reported seeing smoke in the distance. Captain Porter called an immediate halt, and the men gathered to discuss their options. They could either turn back and add 2 days to their journey, or continue forward and risk whatever lay ahead. Margaret sat in the shade of her wagon, listening to the heated debate that followed. Some wanted to press on, arguing that smoke could mean many things and might not indicate danger. Others insisted that any sign of Apache presence meant certain death for the entire group. As the argument continued, the sun climbed higher, and the heat became almost unbearable. Finally, Captain Porter made the decision that would seal Margaret's fate. The group would split up. Those who wanted to take the safer but longer route could do so, while others would continue on the direct path. Margaret found herself in an impossible position. She had barely enough supplies for the journey as planned, and the extra 2 days might mean running out of water and food. Against her better judgment, she decided to stay with the smaller group that chose to continue forward. As they prepared to part ways, Sarah Mitchell, an older woman who had become something of a mother figure to Margaret during the journey, approached her with tears in her eyes. She begged Margaret to come with a larger group, offering to share her own supplies if necessary. Margaret was deeply moved by the offer, but her pride prevented her from accepting what felt like charity. She hugged Sarah goodbye, promising to meet her at the mining camp in a few days. The smaller group consisted of only 4 wagons now, carrying 2 families with young children, an elderly couple, and Margaret. The men were confident they could handle any trouble they might encounter, and the shortened journey time appealed to everyone's desire to reach their destination quickly. They set out just after noon, following the trail that led directly through the heart of the canyon. The attack came without warning, just as the sun was beginning to set. One moment they were making good time along the trail, and the next, Apache warriors seemed to materialize from the rocks themselves. The air filled with war cries, and the sound of arrows whistling past their heads. The horses reared in panic, and chaos erupted as families tried to find cover behind their wagons. Margaret dove under her wagon as bullets and arrows flew overhead. The sound was deafening, men shouting, women screaming, children crying, and horses neighing in terror. Through the dust and confusion, she could see shadowy figures moving between the wagons with deadly efficiency. The battle, if it could even be called that, lasted less than 10 minutes. When the shooting stopped, an eerie silence fell over the canyon. Margaret remained hidden under her wagon, hardly daring to breathe. She could hear footsteps and voices speaking in a language she didn't understand. Occasionally, she caught glimpses of moccasined feet walking past her hiding place. Her heart pounded so loudly she was certain they would hear it. As darkness fell, Margaret realized she was likely the only survivor. The voices had moved away, but she didn't dare come out from her hiding place. She spent the entire night cramped under the wagon, listening to every sound the desert made. Coyotes howled in the distance, and strange insects made clicking noises she had never heard before. Every shadow seemed to hold potential danger, and every sound made her flinch with terror. When dawn finally broke, Margaret cautiously emerged from her hiding place to survey the devastation. The scene that greeted her was worse than anything she had imagined. The wagons had been ransacked, their contents scattered across the desert floor. Personal belongings she recognized lay broken and abandoned in the sand. Most heartbreaking of all, she found no other survivors among her fellow travelers. Standing alone in that desolate canyon, with nothing but the clothes on her back and the vast, unforgiving desert stretching in every direction, Margaret faced the stark reality of her situation. She was completely lost, with no food, no water, and no idea which direction led to safety. The mining camp that had seemed like salvation now felt impossibly far away. As the sun began to climb higher, bringing with it the promise of another scorching day, Margaret made a decision that surprised even herself. Instead of sitting down to wait for death, she began walking. She had no plan, no supplies, and no real hope of survival, but something deep inside her refused to give up without a fight. She gathered what little she could find among the scattered belongings: a torn piece of canvas for shade, a small metal cup that had somehow survived the attack, and a handful of hardtack biscuits that the Apache had apparently deemed unworthy of taking. With these meager supplies, she set out into the unknown, following what appeared to be a game trail leading away from the scene of the attack. The desert was unlike anything Margaret had ever experienced. The heat was so intense it seemed to press down on her from above, while the sand beneath her feet radiated warmth that penetrated through the soles of her worn boots. Within an hour of walking, she had consumed most of her small water supply, not yet understanding how precious every drop would become. As she struggled forward, Margaret couldn't help but think about the Apache warriors who had attacked their wagon train. Everything she had been taught about them suggested they were ruthless killers who showed no mercy. Yet something puzzled her about the attack. If they were truly as bloodthirsty as everyone claimed, why had they taken the time to search through the wagons so thoroughly? And why had they left behind certain items while taking others? These questions would soon become irrelevant as Margaret faced the more immediate challenge of survival. The sun showed no mercy as it climbed toward its zenith, and she began to understand why so many people feared this land. It was beautiful in its own way, but it was also deadly to anyone unprepared for its harsh realities. By midday, Margaret's water was gone, and she was forced to seek whatever shade she could find among the scattered rocks and stunted desert plants. Her lips were already beginning to crack, and She could feel the sun burning through her clothing. As she sat in the meager shadow of a large boulder, she began to wonder if she had made a terrible mistake by leaving the wagon train behind. The sound of approaching footsteps on gravel made her blood freeze in her veins. Margaret pressed herself against the boulder, trying to make herself as small as possible. The footsteps were deliberate and unhurried, suggesting someone who knew the terrain well and feared no danger. She held her breath, praying that whoever was approaching would pass by without noticing her hiding place. The sound grew closer, accompanied by what seemed to be the soft padding of unshod horses. When the footsteps stopped just on the other side of her boulder, Margaret knew she had been discovered. She closed her eyes and waited for whatever fate awaited her, thinking of James and wishing she could have died beside him rather than alone in this foreign wilderness. The silence stretched on for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. A shadow fell across her hiding place, and she looked up to see a tall figure silhouetted against the bright sky. As her eyes adjusted, she found herself staring at a man unlike any she had ever encountered. He appeared to be in his 30s, with long black hair that gleamed in the sunlight and bronze skin that spoke of a lifetime spent under the desert sun. His clothing was a mixture of traditional Apache garments and items that had clearly been acquired from white settlements: leather leggings, a cotton shirt, and a vest that looked like it might have once belonged to a cavalry officer. What struck Margaret most were his eyes. Instead of the savage cruelty she had been taught to expect, she saw intelligence, caution, and something that might have been curiosity. He studied her for a long moment without speaking, taking in her disheveled appearance and obvious distress. 2 horses stood behind him, and Margaret realized he must have tracked her from the wagon train. The Apache warrior spoke in his own language, a series of sounds that were completely foreign to Margaret's ears. When she didn't respond, he switched to broken English, his voice deep and carefully measured. "You alone," he said, more as a statement than a question. "Others dead." Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice to work properly. Her mouth was so dry that she wasn't sure she could speak even if she tried. The man continued to study her, and she wondered if he was deciding whether to kill her quickly or leave her to die slowly in the desert. Either way, she supposed it didn't matter much. Instead of violence, however, the warrior did something completely unexpected. He reached into a leather pouch at his side and pulled out a water gourd, offering it to her with a gesture. Margaret stared at it for several seconds, unable to comprehend what was happening. This went against everything she had been told about his people. When she hesitated to take the water, the warrior set it down within her reach and stepped back. "Drink," he said simply. "Sun kill you soon." The kindness in this simple act was so unexpected that Margaret began to cry. She reached for the water gourd with trembling hands and drank deeply, feeling the liquid bring life back to her parched throat. The warrior watched without comment, occasionally glancing at the sky as if calculating how much daylight remained. As Margaret finished drinking, the warrior spoke again. "Why you not with others when we come?" His English was halting but understandable, and she sensed he was making an effort to communicate with her in her own language. "I was hiding," she managed to say, her voice raspy despite the water. "Under the wagon." The warrior nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Smart. Others fight. Fighting bad when no chance to win." He paused, studying her face carefully. "You have family? Someone who looks for you?" Margaret shook her head, fresh tears threatening to fall. "No one. My husband died, and I was going to meet his brother at a mining camp, but now—" She gestured helplessly at the vast desert around them. The warrior was quiet for a long time, apparently considering her situation. Finally, he asked, "You have name?" "Margaret," she said. "Margaret Thompson." The warrior nodded respectfully. "I'm called Nailnish. In your tongue, it means he works. My English name for mission school is Joseph, but I prefer my Apache name." The revelation that this man had attended a mission school surprised Margaret. She had assumed that all Apache people lived completely separate from white civilization. The fact that he could speak English at all suggested a more complex relationship between their peoples than she had been led to believe. Nailnish studied the position of the sun again, then made a decision that would change both of their lives. Desert is dangerous at night for someone who does not know the ways. There are animals that hunt, and the cold can kill as surely as the heat. You cannot survive alone. Margaret understood what he was saying, but she couldn't fathom why he was saying it. "Are you going to kill me?" she asked quietly. Nailnish looked genuinely puzzled by the question. "Why would I kill you? You have done nothing to me or my people. You are lost and alone. My grandmother taught me that helping those in need brings honor, regardless of the color of their skin." This simple statement challenged everything Margaret thought she knew about Apache people. The stories she had heard painted them as merciless killers who took pleasure in causing suffering. Yet here was one of their warriors offering her help when he could have easily killed her or simply left her die. "I don't understand," Margaret said. "Why did your people attack our wagon train if you believe in helping others?" Nailnish's expression grew more serious. "Your people travel through our land without permission, bringing guns and soldiers who kill our children and steal our horses. We defend what is ours, as you would defend what is yours. But you are not a soldier, and you carry no weapons. You are just a woman trying to survive." The logic of his explanation was undeniable, though it forced Margaret to confront uncomfortable truths about the story she had been told. Perhaps there were two sides to every conflict, and perhaps the Apache had reasons for their actions that went beyond simple savagery. As the afternoon wore on, Nailnish made preparations for travel. He offered Margaret some dried meat from his supplies, and explained that they would need to move soon if they wanted to reach shelter before nightfall. "My camp is half a day's ride from here," he said. "You can ride behind me on my horse. It will be faster than walking." The idea of going willingly to an Apache camp terrified Margaret, but she realized she had no other choice. The alternative was certain death in the desert, and Nailnish had already shown her more kindness than she had any right to expect. She nodded her agreement, though her heart raced with fear and uncertainty. Before they left, Nailnish did something else that surprised her. He walked back to the site of the wagon train attack and performed what appeared to be a ritual over the fallen travelers. He spoke in his own language for several minutes, occasionally looking skyward. When Margaret asked what he was doing, he explained that he was asking the spirits to guide the souls of the dead to their proper resting place. "Death is sacred," he said simply. "Even in war, we honor the brave dead." This reverence for human life, even that of his enemies, further challenged Margaret's preconceptions. She watched as this supposed savage showed more respect for her fellow travelers than some white men she had known would have shown for their own neighbors. As they prepared to mount his horse, Nailnish gave Margaret a piece of cloth to wrap around her head and face. "Desert wind carries sand like needles," he explained. "This will protect your skin and help you breathe." The ride to his camp was unlike anything Margaret had ever experienced. Nailnish guided his horse along paths that were invisible to her untrained eye, navigating through terrain that seemed impassable. They moved through narrow canyons where the rock walls rose high above their heads, creating a natural corridor that provided blessed shade from the blazing sun. During the journey, Nailnish occasionally pointed out various plants and landmarks, explaining their significance in his people's way of life. He showed her which cacti provided water in emergencies, which plants could be used for medicine, and how to read the signs that indicated the presence of animals or other dangers. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and red, they reached a hidden valley that opened up suddenly before them. Margaret gasped in amazement at what she saw. Instead of the primitive camp she had expected, she found herself looking at a well-organized community of traditional Apache dwellings, gardens, and corrals containing horses and other livestock. Children played near the water source that fed the valley, their laughter echoing off the surrounding cliffs. Women worked at various tasks around the camp, some preparing food, others crafting tools or clothing. Men tended to horses or worked on weapons and equipment. It was a scene of normal peaceful life that bore no resemblance to the savage war camp she had imagined. As they approached the camp, people stopped their activities to stare at the unusual sight of their warrior returning with a white woman. Margaret could see curiosity, suspicion, and concern on various faces, but no one seemed particularly hostile. Children gathered around to get a better look at her, chattering excitedly in their own language. Nailnish helped Margaret down from his horse and spoke to the gathered crowd in Apache, apparently explaining her situation and his decision to bring her here. There was considerable discussion, with several older men and women asking questions that Margaret couldn't understand. Throughout the conversation, Nailnish remained calm and respectful, but also firm in his position. Finally, an elderly woman approached Margaret and studied her carefully. She was small and weathered, with intelligent eyes that seemed to see everything. After a moment, she spoke to Nailnish in Apache, and he translated for Margaret. "This is my grandmother, Isin. She says you may stay until you are strong enough to continue your journey. She also says you look like you haven't eaten a proper meal in many days, and that no one should go hungry while there is food to share." The kindness of these words, coming from people she had been taught to fear, overwhelmed Margaret completely. She began to cry again, this time from relief and gratitude rather than terror. Isin stepped forward and gently took her hand, speaking softly in Apache. Even without understanding the words, Margaret could hear the maternal comfort in the old woman's voice. As night fell over the hidden valley, Margaret found herself sitting by a warm fire, eating the best meal she had tasted in weeks. The Apache people had welcomed her with a generosity that shamed her previous assumptions about them. As she listened to the soft conversations around the fire and watched children play in the firelight, she began to understand that everything she thought she knew about these people had been wrong. Margaret woke to the sound of birds singing and the gentle murmur of voices speaking in Apache. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was, and then the events of the previous day came flooding back. She was lying on a comfortable bed of soft furs inside a traditional Apache dwelling, warmer and more rested than she had been in weeks. Sunlight filtered through the entrance of the shelter, creating patterns on the woven walls. She could smell wood smoke and something delicious cooking, making her stomach rumble with hunger. As she sat up, she noticed that someone had left clean clothes beside her bed, a simple but well-made dress in the Apache style, along with soft moccasins that looked like they would fit her feet perfectly. Isin appeared at the entrance of the dwelling, carrying a bowl of water and some items Margaret didn't recognize. The elderly woman smiled warmly and gestured for Margaret to wash, then indicated the new clothes. Through a mixture of gestures and simple words, she made it clear that Margaret's old dress had been badly damaged and dirty from her ordeal in the desert. As Margaret changed into the Apache clothing, she was struck by how comfortable and practical it was. The dress was made from soft deerskin that moved with her body, and the moccasins felt like walking on clouds compared to her worn boots. When she emerged from the dwelling, she found that several people had gathered to see her, including children who stared at her with open curiosity. Nailnish approached and greeted her with what appeared to be genuine concern for her well-being. "You slept well?" he asked in his careful English. "Grandmother says the spirits brought good dreams to help heal your fear." Margaret nodded, though she wasn't sure how to express what she was feeling. The kindness these people had shown her was beyond anything she could have imagined. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "All of you. I was told such terrible things about your people, but none of them were true." Nailnish translated her words for the others, and Margaret saw several people nod with understanding. An older man spoke at length in Apache, and Nailnish turned back to Margaret. "My uncle says that white people tell many stories about us that are not true, just as we sometimes tell stories about white people that are not true. He says that fear makes people believe lies more easily than truth." This simple observation struck Margaret as profoundly wise. She began to think about all the stories she had heard about Apache people and realized that none of them had come from anyone who actually knew any Apache personally. They were all based on rumors, newspaper accounts, and tales told by people who had reasons to portray the Apache as savage enemies. Issen took Margaret by the hand and led her on a tour of the camp, showing her how the Apache people live their daily lives. Margaret was amazed by the sophistication of their society. They had developed complex systems for managing water, growing food in the harsh desert environment, and creating beautiful crafts from natural materials. She watched women weave baskets so tightly they could hold water and observed men working with metals to create tools and weapons that were both functional and artistic. Children attended lessons where they learned traditional stories, practical skills, and the complex oral history of their people. It was clear that the Apache had a rich culture that had been developed over many generations. Nailnish served as Margaret's translator and guide, patiently explaining customs and answering her questions. She learned that the Apache people had a deep spiritual connection to the land that went far beyond simple ownership. They saw themselves as caretakers of the desert, responsible for maintaining the delicate balance that allowed life to flourish in such a harsh environment. Your people see land as something to be owned and changed, Nailnish explained as they sat overlooking the valley. We see land as something that owns us and changes us. We are part of the desert, and it is part of us. When white settlers come and dig mines or build fences, they break the connections that have existed for thousands of years. Margaret began to understand why there was so much conflict between white settlers and the Apache. It wasn't just about territory. It was about completely different ways of understanding the world and humanity's place in it. The Apache way seemed more harmonious and sustainable, though she kept this observation to herself. As the days passed, Margaret found herself helping with various tasks around the camp. Issen taught her how to prepare traditional foods, showing her which plants were edible and how to combine them for maximum nutrition. Margaret was surprised to discover that the Apache diet was actually quite varied and healthy despite the harsh environment they lived in. She learned to grind corn and other seeds into flour, to preserve meat by drying it in the desert sun, and to extract water from unexpected sources. The women also taught her their methods for making soap from yucca plants and for treating various ailments with natural medicines. Margaret had always prided herself on her domestic skills, but she realized she had much to learn from these women who had mastered the art of thriving in one of the world's most challenging environments. The children of the camp quickly adopted Margaret as an honorary aunt, chattering at her in Apache and teaching her words in their language. She found herself laughing more than she had since James died, delighted by their games and their innocent questions about her pale skin and light hair. They seemed to accept her presence without any of the suspicion or fear that adults often carried. One evening, as Margaret sat by the fire listening to stories told by the camp's elders, she realized that she no longer thought of herself as a prisoner or even a guest. Somehow, without noticing exactly when it happened, she had begun to think of herself as part of the community. The Apache people had made her feel more welcome in a few days than she had felt anywhere since her husband's death. Nailnish noticed her thoughtful mood and sat beside her. "You are sad tonight," he observed. "Are you thinking of your people?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "I'm thinking about what my people would say if they knew where I was and how I'm being treated. They would never believe that Apache people could be so kind to a white woman." "And what do you believe now?" Nailnish asked quietly. "I believe I've been lied to my entire life," Margaret replied. "Not intentionally, perhaps, but lied to nonetheless. I was taught that your people were savages who couldn't be reasoned with or trusted. But I've been here for a week, and I've seen nothing but wisdom, kindness, and honor." Nailnish was quiet for a long time before responding. "There are good and bad people among all nations," he said finally. "Apache people can be fierce warriors when we must defend our families and our land. We have killed white soldiers and settlers who threatened us. But we're also fathers and mothers, grandparents and children. We love and grieve and hope just as your people do." Margaret nodded, understanding that the reality of any people was always more complex than the stories told about them. She began to wonder what other assumptions she had made about the world that might be equally wrong. As her second week in the camp began, Margaret started to contribute more meaningfully to the community's daily life. Her sewing skills, honed by years of mending and making clothes for herself and James, proved valuable in repairing and creating garments. The Apache women were impressed by some of her techniques, while she learned new methods from them. She also proved helpful in caring for children and elderly members of the community, tasks that required patience and gentleness rather than specific cultural knowledge. Margaret found that grief and joy, worry and comfort were universal human experiences that transcended language barriers. During this time, Margaret also learned more about Nailnish's background. He had indeed attended a mission school as a child, part of a program intended to civilize Apache children by separating them from their families and culture, instead of erasing his Apache identity. However, the experience had given him valuable skills in navigating between two worlds. "I learned to read and write in English," he told her one afternoon as they gathered medicinal plants. "I studied white man's history and religion, but I never forgot who I really was or where I came from. When I was old enough, I left the school and returned to my people." Margaret asked why he had shared water with her and brought her to the camp, risking potential problems with his own people by helping an enemy. Nailnish was quiet for a long time before answering. "At the mission school, there was a teacher named Miss Sarah who was kind to me when others were cruel," he said. "She saw that I was homesick and afraid, and she helped me learn without trying to destroy who I was inside. When I saw you alone and frightened in the desert, I remembered her kindness. I thought perhaps I could show the same mercy to someone from her people." This revelation moved Margaret deeply. The idea that her rescue had been inspired by one white person's kindness to a lonely Apache child created a connection across time and culture that seemed almost miraculous. As the days grew shorter and cooler, Margaret knew that decisions about her future would need to be made soon. Winter was approaching, and travel would become more difficult. The mining camp where her brother-in-law waited was still many days' journey away, and she would need guides and supplies to make the trip safely. More importantly, Margaret was beginning to question whether she really wanted to continue to the mining camp at all. Her original plan had been born of desperation and lack of options, but she was no longer the same desperate woman who had set out for Missouri months earlier. Living with the Apache people had changed her understanding of what was possible in life. She had discovered strengths and capabilities she never knew she possessed. She had found acceptance and purpose in a community that valued her contributions. Most surprisingly, she had found peace in a life that was completely different from anything she had ever imagined for herself. As she fell asleep each night in her comfortable shelter, listening to the sounds of the desert and the soft conversations of her adopted family, Margaret began to wonder if perhaps the spirits had guided her to exactly where she was supposed to be. The morning that would force Margaret to confront her future began like any other. She woke before dawn and helped Issen prepare the morning meal, a routine that had become as natural as breathing. The elderly Apache woman had become like a mother to her, teaching not just practical skills, but also sharing the deep wisdom that came from a lifetime of observing human nature and the natural world. As they worked together, grinding corn and preparing vegetables, Issen spoke to her in the mixture of Apache words and gestures that Margaret had learned to understand. The old woman was concerned about something, though Margaret couldn't quite grasp what was troubling her. It wasn't until Nailnish joined them that the source of Issen's worry became clear. "Grandmother has been having dreams," Nailnish explained quietly. "Dreams of soldiers coming to our valley. She believes there will be trouble soon if you stay with us much longer." Margaret felt her stomach drop as the implications of this warning sank in. She had been so caught up in the peace and acceptance she had found with the Apache people that she had almost forgotten she was still technically a missing white woman. By now, word of the wagon train attack would have spread, and there would likely be search parties looking for survivors. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a young Apache warrior who had been serving as a scout in the surrounding area. He spoke rapidly to Nailnish in their own language, his tone urgent and worried. Margaret didn't need a translation to understand that he was bringing bad news. Nailnish's expression grew grave as he listened to the scout's report. When the young man finished speaking, Nailnish turned to Margaret with obvious reluctance. Bluecoat soldiers are camped 1 day's ride from here. They have Apache scouts with them, men from other bands who work for the army. They are asking questions about missing white women and offering rewards for information. The peaceful morning suddenly felt charged with danger. Margaret realized that her presence in the camp had put all these kind people at risk. If soldiers found her here, they would assume she had been kidnapped rather than rescued. The Apache people who had saved her life and treated her with such kindness would be blamed for crimes they hadn't committed. "I have to leave," Margaret said immediately. "I won't let my presence bring trouble to your people." Issen reached out and took Margaret's hands in her own weathered ones, speaking earnestly in Apache. Nailnish translated, "Grandmother says you are family now, and family does not abandon family when there is danger. She says there may be another way." Over the next several hours, the leadership of the camp gathered to discuss options. Margaret was amazed to discover that decision-making among the Apache was much more democratic than she had expected. Everyone who wanted to speak was given a chance to voice their opinion, including women and younger men who would have had no voice in similar discussions among white communities. The debate was intense, but respectful, with various people proposing different solutions to the problem Margaret's presence had created. Some suggested hiding her until the soldiers moved on. Others proposed escorting her to a distant settlement where she could rejoin white society safely. A few even suggested that she might stay permanently, adopting Apache ways completely and hiding her true identity if soldiers ever came to the valley. Throughout the discussion, Margaret found herself torn between conflicting emotions. Part of her wanted nothing more than to stay with these people who had become her family. She had found purpose, acceptance, and peace among the Apache in a way she had never experienced in white society. The idea of returning to the loneliness and struggle of her former life felt like a death sentence. At the same time, she knew that her presence genuinely endangered the entire community. If soldiers found her here, they would not listen to explanations about rescue and kindness. They would see only an Apache camp holding a white captive, and the consequences would be terrible for everyone involved. As the sun reached its zenith, Nailnish approached Margaret with a proposal that had emerged from the council discussions. "There's a trading post 3 days' ride from here, run by a man named Rodriguez who deals honestly with both Apache and white people. He has Mexican workers and sometimes hides people who need to disappear for a while. If we can get you there safely, you could decide what to do next without putting our people in danger." Margaret knew this was probably the best option available, but the thought of leaving the valley filled her with grief. She had never imagined that she could feel so attached to a place and people she had known for such a short time. The prospect of returning to the uncertain and often hostile world of white settlements felt overwhelming. Issen seemed to sense Margaret's inner turmoil. That evening, she took her for a walk up the sides of the valley to a place where they could see the stars clearly. The old woman spoke for a long time in Apache, her voice gentle but firm. When they returned to camp, Nailnish translated what his grandmother had said. "She told you that life is like a river that flows through many different landscapes," Nailnish explained. "Sometimes it flows through mountains, sometimes through desert, sometimes through green valleys. The river does not choose its path, but it learns from every place it travels. She says your path brought you to us for a reason, but it may lead you to other places where you are also needed." Margaret understood the wisdom in these words, but it didn't make the prospect of leaving any easier. She spent her last night in the valley walking through the camp, memorizing every detail. She watched children playing games their ancestors had played for centuries, listened to the soft conversations of families around their fires, and breathed in the scent of smoke and desert flowers that had become as familiar as home. Early the next morning, preparations began for Margaret's journey to the trading post. Issen packed food and supplies, including a water gourd and a blanket woven in traditional Apache patterns. The other women gave her gifts, a small knife in a beautifully decorated sheath, a bag for carrying personal belongings, and various herbal medicines that might prove useful in the future. Nailnish would escort her to the trading post along with 2 other warriors, traveling by paths known only to the Apache that would avoid any areas where soldiers might be patrolling. They planned to present Margaret as a woman whose wagon had broken down and who needed assistance getting to the nearest settlement. As they prepared to depart, Margaret found herself struggling to hold back tears. She had said goodbye to many people and places in her life, but this farewell felt different. These people had saved not just her life, but her spirit, showing her kindness and acceptance when she had expected only death. Issen embraced her like a beloved daughter, speaking softly in Apache. Nailnish translated. She says to remember that you will always have family here, no matter where your river takes you. She also says to trust the strength you have found within yourself, because it will serve you well in whatever challenges lie ahead. The children of the camp gathered to say goodbye, presenting Margaret with small gifts they had made themselves, carved animals, braided grass ornaments, and drawings made with colored clay. Their innocent affection and sadness at her departure nearly broke her composure completely. As they mounted their horses and prepared to leave the hidden valley, Margaret turned back one last time to look at the place that had become home. The morning sun was painting the cliffs in shades of gold and red, and smoke from the breakfast fires rose straight up into the still air. People went about their daily activities, but many paused to wave farewell. The journey to Rodriguez's trading post took them through some of the most beautiful and treacherous country Margaret had ever seen. They traveled mostly at night to avoid detection, resting during the heat of the day in caves and hidden canyons that provided shelter and concealment. Nailnish and his companions moved through this landscape like spirits, reading signs and avoiding dangers that Margaret couldn't even perceive. During their rest periods, Nailnish continued Margaret's education about Apache ways of understanding the world. He taught her to read the stories written in animal tracks, to find water by watching the flight patterns of birds, and to predict weather changes by observing subtle signs in the sky and wind. These skills may seem useless to white people, he said, but they connect you to the world in ways that make you stronger and wiser. Knowledge is never wasted, no matter where life takes you. As they approached the trading post on the 3rd day, Margaret felt a mixture of anxiety and sadness. She was grateful for the safety and opportunity that lay ahead, but she dreaded the moment when she would have to say goodbye to Nailnish and return to a world that suddenly seemed foreign and hostile. Rodriguez's trading post was a sprawling collection of adobe buildings situated at the confluence of 2 desert streams. It was clearly a place where cultures mixed freely. Margaret could see Mexican vaqueros, Apache traders, and white settlers all conducting business together with apparent ease. The atmosphere was relaxed and welcoming, suggesting that Rodriguez had indeed created a safe haven for people from different backgrounds. Rodriguez himself proved to be a weathered man in his 50s with intelligent eyes and a careful manner of speaking. When Nailnish explained Margaret's situation in fluent Spanish, Rodriguez listened without judgment, occasionally asking clarifying questions. Finally, he turned to Margaret and addressed her in accented but clear English. "Senora, you are welcome to stay here while you decide what you want to do with your life. I ask no questions about people's past, only that they work hard and cause no trouble while they are under my roof. If you wish to continue to your brother-in-law's mining camp, I can arrange safe passage. If you wish to go somewhere else, we can discuss options." There is no hurry to decide. The kindness of this offer, coming so soon after the generosity she had experienced with the Apache, reminded Margaret that goodness existed in people of all backgrounds. She accepted Rodriguez's hospitality gratefully, though her heart remained heavy at the thought of Nailnish's departure. That evening, as Nailnish prepared to return to his people, Margaret struggled to find words adequate to express her gratitude. Everything she thought to say seemed insufficient to convey what his kindness had meant to her. "You saved my life," she finally said simply. "Not just from death in the desert, but from dying inside. You showed me that the world is bigger and more beautiful than I ever knew, and that people are capable of more goodness than I believed possible." Nailnish smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. "You saved something of mine as well," he said. "You reminded me that my grandmother's teachings about kindness to strangers are always worth following, even when it seems dangerous. You helped me remember that there are good people among all nations." As Nailnish and his companions disappeared into the desert darkness, Margaret stood, watching until she could no longer see even the silhouettes of their horses. She felt as though a chapter of her life was ending, but she wasn't sure what the next chapter would bring. Margaret spent the first week at Rodriguez's trading post, helping with daily operations while she considered her options. The work was familiar, yet different from what she had known. She cooked meals for travelers, mended clothes and equipment, and helped manage the small store that served the diverse community of people who passed through the remote outpost. What struck her most about the trading post was how naturally people of different backgrounds worked and lived together. Mexican vaqueros shared meals with Apache traders, white settlers conducted business with Navajo craftsmen, and everyone seemed to accept these interactions as normal. It was a sharp contrast to the rigid racial division she had known in Missouri and other white settlements. Rodriguez proved to be not just a successful businessman, but also a wise observer of human nature. He watched Margaret carefully during her first few days, noting how she interacted with different people and how she handled various tasks. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the desert sky, he broached the subject of her future plans. "You have been thinking much about where to go next," Rodriguez observed, more as a statement than a question. "But perhaps you are asking the wrong question. Perhaps you should ask not where to go, but who you want to become." Margaret had been wrestling with exactly this issue. The woman who had fled Missouri in desperation seemed like a stranger to her now. Her time with the Apache people had awakened parts of herself she never knew existed: courage, adaptability, and a deep appreciation for ways of life completely different from her own upbringing. "I received a letter yesterday from my brother-in-law's mining camp," Margaret told Rodriguez. "Word has spread that there were survivors from the wagon train attack, and he's asking if anyone has news of me. I could continue there as I originally planned, but, Rodriguez prompted gently. "But I'm not the same person who started that journey," Margaret admitted. "I don't think I can go back to being the helpless widow who needed a man to take care of her. I've learned I'm capable of much more than I ever imagined." Rodriguez nodded approvingly. The desert has a way of showing people who they really are underneath all the things society tells them they should be. "What does your heart tell you to do?" Margaret had been asking herself this question for days, and the answer was becoming clearer. "I want to stay here and help you run this place," she said. "I want to be part of something that brings different people together instead of keeping them apart. I want to use what I learned from the Apache people to help other travelers who might be lost or in trouble." Rodriguez smiled broadly. "I was hoping you would say something like that. I'm getting older, and this place needs someone with fresh energy and new ideas. But are you certain? Life here is not easy, and you would be far from your own people." Margaret thought about the Apache camp hidden in its secret valley, about Issen's gentle wisdom and Nailnish's unexpected kindness. "These could become my people," she said firmly. "I've learned that family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it's about the people who choose to accept you for who you are." Over the following months, Margaret threw herself into learning every aspect of the trading post operation. Rodriguez taught her to keep books, negotiate with suppliers, and manage the complex relationships that kept the business running smoothly. She learned basic Spanish and picked up words in Apache and Navajo from regular customers. More importantly, she developed a reputation as someone who could be trusted by people from all backgrounds. Her experience with the Apache had given her insights into Native American concerns and perspectives that few white people possessed, while her own background helped her understand the fears and motivations of white settlers and travelers. Word of the helpful woman at Rodriguez's trading post began to spread throughout the territory. Travelers started coming not just for supplies, but for advice about safe routes, information about local conditions, and sometimes just for a sympathetic ear. Margaret found herself serving as an unofficial mediator when conflicts arose between different groups. She also began writing letters for people who couldn't read or write, helping them communicate with family members in distant places. These letters gave her glimpses into the hopes and struggles of people from many different walks of life. Miners sending money home to families, soldiers writing to sweethearts, traders arranging complex business deals across vast distances. One day, almost 6 months after her arrival at the trading post, Margaret received a visitor who changed everything. She was working in the store when a familiar figure appeared in the doorway. Nailnish, looking much the same as when she had last seen him, but carrying himself with an air of urgency. "There is trouble in my grandmother's camp," he explained after they had greeted each other warmly. "White soldiers are demanding that all Apache people move to a reservation far from our ancestral lands. Many are resisting, and there may be fighting. Grandmother sent me to ask if you might be willing to help." Margaret didn't hesitate. "What can I do?" Nailnish explained that tensions between the Apache and military authorities had been escalating since Margaret's departure. The government was pressuring all Native American groups to relocate to designated reservations, often hundreds of miles from their traditional territories. Many Apache bands were refusing to comply, leading to increased military patrols and threats of force. Grandmother believes that if soldiers hear from a white woman who lived peacefully with Apache people, they might understand that we are not the savages they think we are, Nailnish said. "She thinks your voice might carry weight that Apache voices cannot." The request put Margaret in a difficult position. Speaking out on behalf of the Apache would certainly identify her as someone who had lived among them, potentially creating problems with white authorities. At the same time, she couldn't forget the kindness these people had shown her when she needed help most. Rodriguez, when consulted about the situation, encouraged Margaret to follow her conscience. "Sometimes we must take risks to do what is right," he said. "I have seen how the Apache people conduct themselves when they come here to trade. They are honorable and peaceful until they are forced to defend themselves." After much consideration, Margaret made her decision. She would accompany Nailnish to meet with the military commanders and tell them truthfully about her experiences with the Apache. She couldn't guarantee it would make any difference, but she felt obligated to try. The meeting took place at a military outpost 3 days' ride from the trading post. Margaret found herself facing a colonel and several other officers who listened with obvious skepticism as she recounted her rescue and the months she had spent in the Apache camp. Their questions were sharp and sometimes hostile, clearly designed to expose what they assumed was a fabricated story. "Mrs. Thompson, you expect us to believe that Apache warriors killed everyone else in your wagon train, but saved you out of kindness?" the colonel asked sarcastically. "And that they then treated you as an honored guest rather than a captive?" "I expect you to believe the truth," Margaret replied firmly. "The Apache people who saved me showed more Christian charity than many supposedly civilized white men I have known. They fed me when I was starving, sheltered me when I was lost, and protected me when I was defenseless. They asked for nothing in return except basic human decency." The officers exchanged glances, clearly uncertain how to respond to her passionate defense of people they had been trained to see as enemies. Margaret pressed her advantage. "Colonel, these people have complex societies with laws, traditions, and moral codes just as sophisticated as our own, she continued. They're fighting for their homes and their children's future. If white settlers were being forced from their ancestral lands, wouldn't you expect them to resist? The meeting ended without any clear resolution, but Margaret sensed that her words had at least given the officers something to think about. A few days later, she learned that negotiations had begun between Apache leaders and military officials, with both sides agreeing to discuss alternatives to forced relocation. While these talks ultimately resulted in only limited success, they did lead to some Apache bands being allowed to remain on smaller portions of their traditional territory rather than being forced to move to distant reservations. Margaret knew her intervention had been just one small factor in this outcome, but she felt proud to have played a role in reducing potential bloodshed. As word of Margaret's advocacy for the Apache spread, she found herself in an interesting position. Some white settlers viewed her with suspicion, questioning her loyalty to her own people. Others, particularly those who had had positive interactions with Native Americans themselves, praised her for speaking truth to power. Most importantly to Margaret, she had earned the deep respect of various Apache, Navajo, and other Native American groups who began to see her as a bridge between their world and white society. This role brought both opportunities and challenges, but Margaret found it deeply fulfilling. Years passed, and Margaret became a permanent fixture at the trading post, which grew into a small town under her and Rodriguez's management. She never married again, though she had several offers from men who were attracted to her independence and business acumen. She had learned to value her autonomy too much to surrender it lightly. When Rodriguez died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 72, he left the trading post to Margaret in his will. She continued to operate it as a place where people from different backgrounds could meet on equal terms, and it became known throughout the territory as a haven for anyone seeking fair treatment regardless of their race or background. Margaret maintained contact with the Apache camp throughout her life, visiting when she could and always ensuring that Nailnish and his family knew they had a friend they could count on. Issen lived to be very old, and when she died, Margaret was honored to be invited to participate in the traditional ceremonies honoring her passing. In her final years, Margaret often reflected on the journey that had brought her to such an unexpected life. The desperate widow who had joined that ill-fated wagon train could never have imagined becoming a successful businesswoman who served as a bridge between cultures. Her rescue by Nailnish had saved far more than her life. It had revealed possibilities for existence she never could have conceived in her former world. She wrote letters to distant relatives occasionally, trying to explain her choices, but she found it difficult to convey how completely her understanding of life had been transformed. How could she explain to people who had never left their small communities that the world contained wisdom and beauty in places they would never think to look? Margaret died at the age of 68, surrounded by friends from many different cultures who had come to pay their respects to a woman they all considered remarkable. Her funeral was attended by Apache warriors, Mexican vaqueros, white settlers, and people from a dozen other backgrounds, all united in honoring someone who had spent her life proving that human kindness could transcend any barrier. On her grave marker, carved in both English and Apache, were words that Issen had once spoken to her. The river learns from every landscape it travels through. Margaret Thompson had indeed learned from every landscape of her remarkable journey, and, in turn, she had left those landscapes enriched by her presence. The trading post continued to operate long after her death, maintained by people who understood and shared her vision of a place where differences were celebrated rather than feared. In a small way, her legacy helped plant seeds of understanding that would grow and spread throughout the territory, proving that even one person's commitment to treating others with dignity and respect could have far-reaching consequences. Margaret's story became part of local legend, told around campfires and in family gatherings for generations. But more than just an inspiring tale, it served as a reminder that the most important journeys in life are often the ones that change not where we are, but who we become along the way.